So let me start just by giving a very quick summary of what I did in the last two sessions, just a couple of minutes, and then talk about faith-based engagement in civil society and the state. And then I was also asked in this final session to say a few words about the implications of the book for the academic study of politics. So I'll do that just towards the end. So first of all, a very quick summary of where we've come so far. The first part of the book and the second part of the book we dealt with in the previous two sessions. In the first, I try to present a Christian rationale for constitutional democracy, which I define as a system in which the people's voice is essential and given structured channels to express itself via numerous channels of representation and participation, and in which that voice, the people's voice, together with all other elements of the system, organs of state and so forth, operate within a framework of constitutional principles and restraints that are conducive to the purpose of the state. That is, that the whole system is orchestrated towards that very telos, that very raison d'etre of the state. And in the book, I've tried to define that in terms of the concepts of justice and the common good, and I've spliced those two terms together into the composite term public justice. That's an order of just public law and policy across the whole of society, administered by the state, into which the people contribute. That seeks to do justice to all the particular claims, needs, public goods that a society expects from the state. So that I've suggested, that fundamental purpose is the deepest justification for democracy. So in that sense, I'm turning on its head a contemporary paradigm, which is to say, well, we don't know anything about what the state should do until we first hear from the collective voices of the people, because they are sovereign and they are autonomous and they determine what the shared purposes of the state must be. I'm turning that on its head and saying it's the other way around. Our democratic rights, which we definitely need, rights to stand for office, rights to campaign, and all those other rights, derive fundamentally from our responsibility to contribute to the realization of the purpose of the state, which I've called public justice. So that's the first session. Second session, I went on to say that in order to do that, the full diversity of the people's voices must be heard in democratic channels, including their deepest convictions, the fundamental drives that make them tick, that animate them, their deepest aspirations, which manifest themselves in all sorts of different ways, including at the political level. So the people must be encouraged to and facilitated to draw on and articulate those deepest convictions in ways that may be appropriate in democratic forums. So I've also argued in that section that the state is not entitled, or should not claim the right to define those convictions, those ultimate convictions. Instead, it steps back and leaves that question to us, to individuals and organizations in civil society. What the state does is to create a legal and political framework in which all law-abiding faiths are equally available, equally able to express their political and other views in democratic forums, and that the state should not just listen to people, but engage with all faith communities in appropriate ways, whether that might mean involving them in delivery of public services, for example, not just giving them minimal legal protection. And that model, which I sum up as Christian democratic pluralism, rejects two forms of monism. One is an exclusivist secularism that would push faith to the margins, imposing what it thinks is a neutral public framework on the whole of society, but by smuggling in covert or indeed overt secularist worldview commitments, has the effect of muting or silencing or belittling faith in public forums. So that's a kind of monism that would close down pluralism and close down diversity that we should resist. The other one is the Christian nation model, which wants to give Christian faith the role of a public kind of sacred canopy over the whole society, ratified by the state, maybe in the constitution, possibly through an established church, whatever it might be, a kind of political, a religious establishment in the state that once again threatens to close down plurality, and certainly by privileging one worldview at the state level. Rather, a democratic pluralist state enables people to speak and act politically from their diverse worldviews on the basis of parity with others, in principle parity with others. Okay, that was just a quick wrap up of the first two sessions. Let me move on to the next major theme, which is faith-based engagement in civil society and the state. And I want to flesh out what this means in three areas, and this is corresponding to the three chapters in the book, the final chapters in the book: faithful conscience, faithful association, and faithful power. So briefly first on faithful conscience. A democratic pluralist state should offer a generous protection of freedom of individual conscience. That means, in the first instance, freedom of religion, of course, but it also means freedom of secular conscience. There are some who want to argue that religion is unique and deserves unique legal status, and I'm open to that argument, but at the moment I hold that it's better to think in terms of a composite, a generic freedom of conscience, which includes a diversity of faith perspectives, both religious and secular. That may be something you want to discuss. One way in which states increasingly do this, certainly in Western polities, is by way of exemptions or exceptions to general laws. Laws which disproportionately burden particular kinds of conscience, religious conscience, whether they're Christian, Muslim, or Hindu, or whatever, to allow people to be relieved of particular legal burdens that apply to everybody else, because those burdens burden them disproportionately. So it's a way of securing equality of treatment of conscience by differential legal rights and status. That's one way to help secure space for freedom of conscience. But one point I make in the book is that it's a second best solution. Far better for conscience, plurality of conscience, to be built in at the source when legislation and policy is first made, rather than having to put believers, Christian or otherwise, in the posture of supplicants for exceptional treatment, which is what they largely are at the moment. And therefore, I argue that in Britain, we ought to adopt more formally a practice which is already present in practice, and also actually formally present in Canada, which is the principle of reasonable accommodation, which puts a duty on employers, for example, not to wait for aggrieved individuals or conscientiously burdened individuals to come knocking on their door and saying, please, can I have an exception? But rather, the onus is on them to accommodate a diversity of consciences unless it can be shown that that puts a disproportionate burden on them. I think that's a good principle, and I think it's one that ought to be integrated in some way or another into all legal frameworks. But faithful conscience, of course, doesn't only mean freedom of belief, bear that in mind, or conscience as in a moral sense, but of manifestation. That's why these cases end up in court. It's not that the state is interfering with the grey matter inside our head or the pink matter in our heart. It's because we want to do things in public consonant with our faith. What in law is known as manifestation. And here I think it's important to note that some religions are much more concerned with certain kinds of manifestation than Christians are. Often they're concerned with communal rituals, practices, dress codes, and so forth, which don't feature in Christianity so much, or funeral practices, for example. And so Christians, I think, ought to go out of their way to enter into the lived reality of other faith traditions and stand behind those people when they make their own claims to manifestation or exemption or what it might be. So that's faithful conscience, briefly. Faithful association. This really is faithful conscience writ large at the level of organizations or associations or institutions. As we know, there are in most polities plenty of different kinds of faith-based associations of all kinds, having different legal status, but each of them are attempts to put corporately into practice, to manifest corporately some aspect of a faith commitment, whether it's social welfare, care for children, education, rehabilitation of offenders, whatever it might be. These things flow out of faith and acquire corporate expression in public life. And therefore the state has to deal with them in some sense, has to relate to them in some sense. Now, for faithful associations to make their distinctive contributions to the common good, and the key word there is distinctive, if they're not offering anything distinctive, their case for existence and autonomy is weaker. But for them to make their distinctive contributions to the common good, they need to be able to enjoy a substantial measure of autonomy from outside interference. They need to be able to safeguard their internal beliefs, practices, order. They need to safeguard the coherence of their faith and their practice. They need to establish their continuity over time. And that means they need to have internal authority over those matters. Now, in the case of both faithful conscience and faithful association, what we increasingly see in a number of liberal democratic states is increasing clashes between claims of faithful conscience or association, religious freedom claims, and an expanding regime of equality rights and non-discrimination rights, which are increasingly overriding what many take to be their conscientious obligations. And that's partly due to a reduced or privatized view of what religion is. I mean, if religion is simply seen as a private interior commitment, then in theory it should have no problem with any kind of legal constraint from the outside, whether it's equality rights or anything else. That's, of course, a false view of what religion actually is. Religion inescapably impacts on our public manifestations in a number of areas of the public realm. So these claims, then, of conscience and autonomy need to be articulated coherently, defended consistently, and in cooperation with others who find themselves in the same situation. Let me just add a couple of qualifiers to that general point. First of all, it's not helpful to depict these clashes between religious liberty and equality law, equality rights, simplistically as kind of gladiatorial clashes between religion and secularism, or truth and falsehood. This is the language of the culture war, which is usually very unhelpful and counterproductive. And I've seen specific cases in Britain where this kind of language ends up getting cited in court to the detriment of the case. The cases have been lost partly because of this kind of gladiatorial language. What's more, the right to manifest a faith, individually or associationally, can never be absolute. It's one right among many in a complex legal system that often have to be balanced against each other. And so Christians and others who want to defend these claims must avoid implying that religious freedom rights have some sort of veto over any other kind of right. We need more forensic analyses and critiques of these clashes, and then I think we'll do better in defending them. The other thing I want to say here is that we should not find ourselves in a situation where we are just constantly defending religious liberty rights against equality rights. That actually does not do justice to the full scope of a biblical Christian political theology, which is also committed to equality, indeed radically committed to equality. we should be among those among the foremost of those who are voicing support for equality and non-discrimination rights in many areas, whether it's disability, racial or religious minorities, vulnerable sexual minorities who are victims of persecution or illicit discrimination, and so forth. We have to learn that language as well as the language of religious liberty. Okay, thirdly, briefly, faithful power. I'm scampering through all this quite quickly, but just to help trigger off a few discussion points. So the term faithful power is intended to be provocative, of course, because there are so many bad examples of the use of faithful power today, or what I would call unfaithful power. Not just extremist Islamist terrorism, of course, but many other less pernicious manifestations of faithful power. What I mean by faithful power is simply this. It's the pursuit of faith-inspired political goals via channels of democratic influence available to all. That's all I mean by it. The pursuit of faith-inspired political goals through channels of democratic influence which are available to all. Now, such goals, faith-inspired goals, might well include the defense of the interests of Christians or churches or indeed religions in general. And often in polities where religious freedom is confined and suppressed, and which might be suffering under generally authoritarian regimes, in some cases, that is all that people of faith are able to do because they have no public space to do anything else. They're simply trying to fight their corner for survival. And so they need the support of the global Christian community. And we do not look to them to produce comprehensive manifestos of public justice. But nonetheless, wherever we have space for wider concerns, which is in many places and all liberal democracies, those political goals that we should be seeking should be, in principle, comprehensive. They concern any manifestation, any application of public justice, whether it's in homelessness, the environment, social policy, a vibrant economy, a market economy, whatever it might be. Now, faithful power, I put this in one of the subtitles, should seek neither privilege nor pliance. That is, in the first instance, we should not seek public privilege for Christianity, or even for religion, if that were possible. And I think if we currently enjoy constitutional or other privileges, we should renounce it or share it with others. But nor should we accept a stance of pliance. We should not be pliant in the face of state demands, whatever they may be, risking marginalization. We should be confident pluralists, to cite the title of a book by an American writer, John Inazu. He argues in that book, Confident Pluralism, that we have to accept that we are one among many voices, but that each of us can enter the democratic realm with full confidence on the basis of our faith. Equally, as I've said, we should also defend other minorities if they are being denied a suitable voice. Now, as we make use of these equal democratic rights in responsible and prudent ways, and I say various things about that in the book, we exercise faithful power, and that can take many, many different forms. And in the book, I give several dozen individual examples of what faithful power may look like. I mean, I mentioned, for example, West European Christian democracy in the post-war period. That's one model. Community organizing, which is prominent in the US and also Britain, which is not overtly religious, but in which religious voices are welcomed as contributors to a larger project of campaigning on one or another issue from the grassroots, or other forms of lobbying from civil society through all sorts of organizations, whether it's Tier Fund or you name it. Influence within the system, for example, at the level of parliaments, Congress, and so forth, where there might be Christian organizations working to stimulate Christian influence within those bodies, or within government itself, or outside the system in social movements, mobilizations, protest movements, and so there's a wide suite of possible ways of exercising faithful power. And in principle, Christians and other people of faith are free to use any of them according to resources and circumstance and need.
Thank you again to all of Life Redeemed, and many of you I don't know, but thank you for the invitation to join you today. I came to the first one and I missed the second one. I was at Jonathan's home this week to get a copy of the book. I've read the chapters that he has presented, and I was thinking to myself as I was trying to prepare a response, it would be rather, in fact, it would be better if I was sitting in a pub with a few friends and discussing this book with Jonathan and my own thoughts than to do it in a forum like this where it is being recorded. And what I say is going to remain online for perpetuity. So I want to sort of say that, I don't like to disagree with Jonathan because he has played a huge part in my own thinking as I've developed my praxis in Christian political engagement. But for the sake of this event and wanting to kind of respond, I want to say a few things. It's something like, Jonathan has talked about the glass being half full. I'm going to give a response of, saying why the glass is half empty. So it's a little bit of trying to bring something else in. But before I get there, let me say a couple of things about myself. I was pleasantly surprised that Jonathan had mentioned Jubilee Center and Relationships Foundation in the book on faithful power. I am a trustee of the Relationships Foundation here in the UK, which does Christian political engagement, Christianity being implicit there. But I've also worked 8 years in the Jubilee Center, which is a Christian think tank based in Cambridge. And before that, I worked for an American missionary organization called YWAM. So I'm bringing some of that experience to respond to what Jonathan has said, based on my lived reality, how I've experienced the world. And as Bruce already mentioned, at the moment I work in Tier Fund, and one of the roles is to be director of the Justice Conference, but I've also got this other hat in Tier Fund, which is theological influencing. Let's get to what Jonathan has said. Jonathan, thank you. Thank you for writing this book. I've known your works, especially when you were at Kleist, and sort of Christian engagement in democracies. But I found that you have helped to sort of make a stronger case for both Christian participation, but also why Christians should be vocal and robust in defending the democratic ideal, this kind of democratic system we have. Let me start off by mentioning 3 experiences that show the struggles of living this ideal that Jonathan has presented for us, or the challenge he has presented for us. First one, I used to live in Luton, which is a place just north of London, which has a large Kashmiri Muslim community. And I did some community organizing. I got to know faith leaders there, and I realized that actually on the ground, when you begin to try to live out this pluralism, it's almost impossible. So, for example, in local government, the Kashmiri community came with an approach that said, for a long time, we've been victims of racism, of discrimination here in the society. And now that we are beginning to get a hold of the levers of power, it is our turn to privilege ourselves. So in a sense, while we don't want a zero-sum game approach, in terms of licenses for opening shops or other sort of goods, political goods, they're not unlimited. Which means if you decide that a Kashmiri from your community should benefit, somebody else is being denied that good. And I felt the view was they were collectively wanting to only look at their own interest. They believe that is necessary because of where they've come from the margins. And in that kind of context, this sort of pluralism is very challenging, because the person who sort of affirms this pluralism is at a disadvantage when your interlocutor is actually believing in a sort of exclusivist approach to how you do politics. So that's one example that I found, that actually both the history of feeling like you've been a victim, but also ethnic and religious identity made you want to engage in politics in a certain way. And how does this democratic pluralism work in that kind of context? I think that's the first example. All that to say that on the ground, it was very difficult to argue against that, because in some sense, it is believed that politics, almost in a Hobbesian sense, you have to look after your group and your interest. The second example that I want to highlight is, I worked for 10 years in a Christian missions organization, mainly an American missions organization, and I don't have a problem saying this publicly, is that there was very little, if any, commitment to democracy as being a good thing, because of course, democracy was talked about as a good thing comparing to totalitarian states like the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But in the current situation, a lot of my American friends believed that actually we must sort of an approach that you mentioned in your book, Jonathan, the 7 mountains approach. The idea was we need to go in there and seize power and use the power to make society either Christian or aligned to Christian interest. And again, that was very discouraging for me, because it seemed like many of the Christians in that world were coming from somewhat sort of charismatic Pentecostal backgrounds, and there was not any vision or commitment to pluralism. In fact, pluralism was seen as something, as a bad thing, because we can talk about pluralism, but at the end of the day, if it's going to lead to a disadvantage to our own group, then what is good about pluralism? So I think that was my second sort of example, and sort of, in my journey, in my lived reality, I realized that it was very difficult to make an argument for principled pluralism when your starting point is that it almost as a form of we want God's will to be done on earth, and there wasn't this idea of politics as solidarity that you mentioned in your book. It was politics as God's will being done on earth is what the approach was. And the last thing I would say, with my Indian background, having grown up in India and went to university there, my first degree was in India in political science, is Indian democracy and its sort of secular ideal has sort of fallen apart. The Hindu Nationalist Party has basically, in a sense, I don't know if they won the argument, but they certainly have come to control power in a way that no longer seeks to be that democracy that the founding father of our nation, Nehru, but also Ambedkar, who wrote the Constitution, who was the head of the body that wrote the Constitution, believed in. So it seems like for secular, that sort of the word you used in your book, jurisdictional secularism, to work, it has to be built on certain kinds of social capital. And where does that social capital come? Because in the end, the Hindu Nationalist Party is not interested in generating that social capital in which this sort of principled pluralism can exist. So I have had to then grapple with, when I read your book, Jonathan, the thing that kept going through my mind is, what about culture? What about culture? This is again to not say, like I said, I'm not coming at it to disagree with you, but I'm asking questions about where does the social capital come from for this ideal to work? Because in India, in the last 70 years of our democracy, we have gone in the direction against this sort of pluralism. And if we stay on this road, increasingly minorities like Christians and Muslims are going to feel like the only future for us is to leave the country. So let me, how am I doing on time? Let me just sort of maybe ask a couple of questions and leave it there.
That's fine. That's good.
Okay. Couple of points, Jonathan. Maybe there are things you want to respond to, but let me say a couple more things as I've thought about these 3 chapters and the book in general. Is it seems like the difference between Christianity and secularism is one of degree. I mean, in some sense, I think secularism is a bastard child of Christianity. And so there is still a commitment somewhere to equality. Whereas the difference between Christianity and Islam, and I'm not trying to go down the culture war road, but it seems like the difference between Christianity and Islam is one in kind, where there is a clear, I mean, there are many kinds of Islams, of course, I'm aware of that. Islam in India is somewhat different from Islamic practices in Pakistan. And so it seems like when we conflate religion and Christianity, it doesn't always seem to translate into practice how you engage with with religious groups that don't have the same buy-in to this idea of equality? So that's, I think, one question I had. I think the second thing I've been thinking about as I read through the book was, do you believe that Christians are always praying, thy kingdom come? There's a sense in which Christians want his kingdom to come. Do you believe that if the kingdom has come, the highest political, if we are to evolve in how we do politics and evolution of political institutions, this thing that you're proposing would be the highest ideal? To get here would be the sort of aim of God's kingdom coming, or is it a sort of a step in the way? I'm very interested to see this ideal, are we aspiring for it because this is God's kingdom come? It looked like this. It looked like what Jonathan has written in his book. I think those are the two things that have gone through my mind as I read the book. Again, as I said, Jonathan, we've been friends for a very long time. I like so much of what is in the book, but I thought this sort of questions would help us to somehow have a much deeper conversation about how do you go from what we have in the book to some of the stories I've said from Luton and from my time, with engaging a bit of US politics. How do we sort of realize some of the ideals you presented? So I think I'll stop there, and maybe you want to quickly respond, Jonathan, but those were just a few things. But thank you again so much for writing this book and for challenging Christians to participate well in the public square.
Thank you, Philip. You've dived deeply into Jonathan's book here, and it's very helpful to us to hear how you've wrestled with the book. Jonathan, over to you for a few minutes, and then
okay. Wave at me if I'm going on too long. Philip, thanks so much. Those were terrific comments, really insightful, very helpful. And you have exactly pointed to the places where the glass is half full and needs to be filled out, and other voices contribute. So quickly, see if I can respond to some of the main issues there. So just to start with your example from Luton, it's a great example. I cite a kind of similar example in the book when I talk about faithful power, and I give the example of Tower Hamlets in London. It's a borough in London where there's a large proportion of Muslims who have become very politically active and for many years. And what I point out there is that through the operation of kinship structures, of biradiri, particularly from South Asia, there has been a sort of clientelism operating whereby Muslims are elected to the local council, see themselves as operating on behalf of their clients, the Muslims, and delivering goodies to them. A sort of favoritism, an insider politics, which is also very patriarchal, and which younger and ageist, so older male Muslim leaders have dominated that system, and younger people and women especially have been protesting against it. It's a slightly different example, but it's a similar sort of thing where a faith group, so for the first time, begins to, finds itself in public space, finds itself having access to democratic forums, and having been marginalized from them for a long time, both because of exclusion, but also because of lack of resources. So it's not all the result of deliberate exclusion on the part of the majority. It's that it took a while for second, third generation immigrants to get sufficient resources and education and confidence to enter politics. And once they do so, they think, oh wow, now we've got all this power at our disposal. We've got these funds that we administer. It's our turn, as you put it so evocatively. I fully understand that. So two things quickly. There is a sense, is there not, in which it is their turn. And what I mean by that is this. If the system has baked into it a kind of majority bias, whether that's to Christianity, secularism, whiteness, whatever it might be, and if that consistently, as it were, treats unequally certain more recent minorities, then there is a case for a kind of a leveling up. The language of "it's our turn" is the wrong language. But there is arguably a case for a kind of leveling up process in order to bring that community closer to sort of public parity. We're not talking about arithmetical equality here, but to compensate for a long history of marginalization. So there's a certain sense in which that's true. But the key thing is when people like that engage in politics, and when Christians do, we need to encourage them as much as possible to move beyond immediate narrow self-interest and to think in terms of a wider public good. Now, in my experience, every context is going to be different here, but from my research in the UK, that is certainly beginning to happen in the Muslim community. And I give some examples of that. There's a plethora of civil society organizations out there who are doing terrific work that is admirable and that is explicitly or implicitly committed to pluralism. They see themselves as one voice among many, contributing to some larger public good. Even the Muslim Council of Britain is now beginning to come out with large-scale policy statements that go beyond mere Muslim self-interest. So this is a process. Now, you're right to put me on the spot there. What I haven't talked about, let me flip now to the other question about social capital, because there's a direct connection here. What I've not talked about in the book is how to form that social capital, how to form a culture that is conducive to democracy. That would have taken several other, another chapter or two. There's a lot of work done on that. So there's a case, there's a need for that to be integrated into this model, certainly. I say a few things about it in passing, but they certainly need to be elaborated. So you've drawn our attention very much to that need. And I think I saw one of the questions in chat was also raising the question of how to form that social capital. I think one of the reasons perhaps I didn't do it in this book is because these conversations are at the moment dominated by the USA, contributions from the US. They've got oodles of books on democratic pluralism, critiques of it. I wanted to write something for Britain. And in the US, those discussions have to deal with a very, very difficult and powerful reality of culture war, which does not quite pertain in the same way in the UK, certainly not to the same degree. And I suspect neither in Australia or New Zealand, but others can qualify that. And there, almost all the conversation is, or a lot of the conversation from Christians is, democracy's got no future if society is running away from Christianity. Right? We've got to have a kind of national revival once again before we can start engaging constructively in democracy. And that's kind of that hands up approach where they say, well, there's nothing we can do because the culture is so rotten. Right? What can we do? And that leads to one of two responses: either withdrawal, the Benedict option, let's go away for 2 generations until we've formed a new Christian culture, or to a new kind of theocracy of the kind that you mentioned, the Dominion theology. Yeah, society is corrupt. We can't use democracy because that's corrupt as well. Let's try and seize power. Let's use democracy to seize commanding heights of power, and we'll Christianize things from the top down. Well, neither of those, I think, are adequate. So I wanted to try to speak into that middle space. But you're right, it doesn't say much about the formation of that kind of social capital, and we need to hear that. Finally, if I can just quickly, So you pointed out that Christianity and secularism seem to share a commitment to equality, whereas Islam doesn't. And you've also mentioned Hindu nationalism, which also doesn't. It's the same challenge there, except in a very different setting. How can we, is it only Christianity, or let's say secularized Christianity, that can guarantee democratic equality? Well, funnily enough, I've just been at a conference last week on religions and democracy, and I heard some excellent papers on Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam on these very questions. And what's fascinating in each of those cases is that the dominant tradition in each of those 3 religions is profoundly non-democratic. But in the last, 100 years, even 50 years, there's a whole generation of thinkers who are emerging in each of them, attempting to draw on the best in those traditions to turn those resources towards democratic ends. Now, for the most part, they're minorities in their traditions. But all I'll say here is they are there, they are busy, they are working, and we need to seek those people out and form alliances with them because they need us, and in certain settings, we're going to need them as well.